Just a small suggestion. I sat down and about 50 people disappeared from my sight. So if you're somebody for whom I have just vanished behind a pillar, you may want to move. Or you may want to keep the pillar. And remember me always as a strange talking pillar, which would be unique if nothing else. But feel very free. There are seats over there. You'll get me in profile, you will see less of Caro. There will be over there, you'll get Caro in profile, see less of me. Maybe a good thing.
I think they really want to see you actually, but it could be wrong.
Anyway, thank you for coming out this Saturday.
Well, yeah, hello and welcome everybody. And again, thank you for coming out on a rainy kind of Saturday. My name's Caro Llewellyn and I am the director of the Penn World Voices Festival, as you can see. And it's my great pleasure to be here today with Neil Gaiman, a man who really needs no introduction at all. And what you don't know about him now, I hope you might know about him by the end of our discussion. But a brief outline of Neil's extraordinary literary life to date. He is, among others, the author of the Sandman and Comics series, Stardust, American Gods, The Anansi Boys, and Coraline. His most recent book is The Graveyard Book, for which he just received the prestigious Newbery Medal, which is given each year to the author of the most distinguished contribution to American literature for children. And by the way, that book made me miss my subway stop once and cry in public on another occasion, but more about that later. His awards are actually so many they are hard to list, but some of them include the World Fantasy Award, the Hugo Award, the Nebula Award, the Bram Stoker Award, the Quill Award, I can't even say the next one, the Mythopoeic Award, and my favorite of all, just for the name of it, the Squiddy Award for Best Writer, which he won 5 years in a row. That surely must be some kind of a record, huh?
I think the Squiddy Awards, as I remember, were handed out way back in the dark days of the internet by Alt Records Comics or something like that. And
it's a great name.
I think as an award, the Squiddies were the best.
Yeah,
I don't know that I ever got anything though. I think because it was an internet award, you never actually got anything physical. And of course, it's the object that's always really fun. You know, there's an Austrian award that I won once, the Ignatz, which is a brick. Because it's named after Ignatz Mouse, and I love my brick.
Yeah.
And I use it from time to time, and I'll use it to hold doors open or whatever, and I'll look at it and I'll think, if I just won another 500,000 of these, I could build a house with it. Exactly.
Yeah. Actually, why don't we start with the awards, because I'm wondering what they mean to you. I mean, I think you won your first award in 1991, and I'm wondering how, as a writer, what they have meant to you, particularly when you were beginning, but also now. I mean, the Newbery Medal is a hugely prestigious award. I think it's been going since 1922, and you're now among some of the great children's book writers. As having been awarded that. But what does it mean for a writer to get an award like that, kind of a big gong like that?
I think the Newbery is very different to most of the awards that I've won. And all of the awards I've won have been thrilling, and they've all meant very different things, normally things about acceptance by your peers, which are just wonderful. But the Newbery does have this strange tradition. I remember when I was, 7, 8 years old,
right.
Finding a copy, the Puffin edition of Madeleine L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time, and reading it and just falling in love with this book. And it said on the front that it was a Newbery Medal winner. And I didn't know what the Newbery Medal was, but A Wrinkle in Time had it, so it had to be cool.
Right.
And
but you've probably made the Newberys a bit cooler than they were before.
I know, I don't think so. I think awards. There was an argument that had been sort of going on, chiefly online, about whether or not the Newbery Award was or should be a book for kids, an award for books that kids enjoyed, or
Right.
an award for books that were good for them. And the last few awards had definitely been for books that were good for them, but that you couldn't really get them to read at gunpoint. And there was a groundswell of grumpiness from teachers and school librarians saying that, excuse me, we like the idea of a Newbery that somebody would enjoy. The truth is that I think if you are a judging panel of any award, you play the cards you're dealt. You read the books that were published that year, and you make your decision of what was the best book based on what's in front of you that year. The sweetest comment I saw was from somebody who was replying to somebody saying, well, why can't books like Holes, Lewis Sacker's Holes had won the Newbery, Graveyard Book, and they said, why can't books like Holes and the Graveyard Book get the Newbery every year? And somebody said, because books like Holes and the Graveyard Book don't get published every year.
That's right, they don't get written every year.
And I thought that was, whether you like the Graveyard Book or not, it's true. It didn't come out every year. It just came out in this one, and you play the card you're dealt.
So let's go back to your life growing up in East Grinstead, reading C.S. Lewis. I think he was one of your favourite writers.
He was.
I'm interested in I'm interested whether or not your sisters, you have two sisters, whether they have whether they dream up ghouls and dead people and...
No, I was the weird one.
Right.
I got a really sweet email from my younger sister, Lizzie, fairly recently, which basically said, and she was about 6 years younger than me. And she said, when I was growing up, I always thought it was really embarrassing and weird to have you as a big brother because nobody else had a brother who would just walk along a street reading a book. And if he bumped into a lamppost, would simply apologize to it and keep walking. Not actually stop reading to check if this was a person or not. And she said this was...
I can somehow picture that with you.
She said this was deeply embarrassing. And she said, and now I'm, 42, and I've just noticed that my brother is cool, and this is really weird. So, did your parents encourage it? Were they telling you ghost stories at night? No, but what they did was they simply gave me the run of the bookshelves.
Right.
They never...
Were they big readers?
They were both. No, my dad was a reader. My mum had been a reader and had stopped, but the house was filled with books. The house was always filled with books. And it had all of her children's books and stuff. And more excitingly for me than that is I got them trained to take me during my school holidays to the library on the way to work. They would drop me off.
You really were a nerd.
Yeah, well, no, I wasn't. I was booky. I wasn't really a nerd. I was bookish. I loved books, and actually, librarians discourage me from telling people this.
Really?
Yes, because they say if you actually do present yourself as a feral child raised by librarians, even more people will use us as free daycare facilities, and this is not good. But it would be very true that I would head off I'd head into the library at 9 o'clock, and occasionally carrying a very embarrassed bag of sandwiches that my dad would have forced me to take with, because normally just not, because you don't want to have sandwiches in the library. It's just wrong somehow. And I would much rather have been hungry than have to carry these sandwiches around with me everywhere. So I would actually sneak out into the car park and eat the sandwiches as quickly as I could, around about 11, just so that they were eaten and I could throw the bag away and not have to carry the sandwiches around. And I would be reading my way around, essentially just read my way through the children's library.
Did you write then at all, or were you doodling?
Yeah.
And
no, I wrote. I wrote poetry. I wrote very bad little short stories that I never quite finished anything of. But my fantasies were of being a writer.
Right.
Other kids' fantasies were about being astronauts or footballers or whatever. My fantasy, when I was 10, maybe 10 or 11, I would have a daydream that was my daydream normally during organized sports. When I would stand at the back
As opposed to unorganized sports or disorganized?
Well, unorganized sports were kind of fun because unorganized sports you're running around and tripping over and grazing your knee and it's sort of fun. But organized sports where you had to change into clothes and march out to some muddy field in the middle of nowhere and stand around while people blew whistles, and occasionally a large, hard, wet leather ball would hit you in the side of the face, coming straight out of nowhere when you were thinking about something perfectly interesting, and which was what I was. But my sort of fantasy at that age was I really wanted to be the person who wrote Lord of the Rings.
Right.
Because I'd read Lord of the Rings, and I could think of nothing cooler than being the person who wrote Lord of the Rings. So I sort of evolved this huge fantasy in which I would be carrying a copy of Lord of the Rings and slip into an alternate dimension exactly the same as ours, except that Tolkien had not existed and had not written Lord of the Rings. And then I would have to get an adult to type this book out, because I knew that if I sent the book in to a publisher, they wouldn't publish it as by me, so I was going to have to persuade an adult to type the whole thing out, then murder the adult. Because you don't want this thing getting traced back to you, honestly. Gonna have to cover your traces, and then I would get to be the author of Lord of the Rings.
Brilliant.
Well, what were your fantasies like when you were 10, Caro?
Not like that. Well, you began as a journalist, and you used that as a way to find out about publishing, and because you wanted to become a writer. And I was absolutely fascinated, and just you went up in my estimation so far because your first book was about Duran Duran.
It was. I got a phone call. I was a young journalist, and
does everybody know who Duran Duran is? No, I mean people are young here. Younger than you and me.
Everybody's younger than you and me.
Yeah, that's right.
So I got a phone call from a publisher saying, "Hello, we are a music publisher, and we publish books about rock bands, and we would like you to write one for us." And I was like, "Oh, great, awesome. Okay, so I want to do the Velvet Underground book, and then I want to do the David Bowie book, and then I'd like to do a book about punk." And they said, okay. We actually have a list of books that need to be written, and you can choose from one of 3 that are on the next ones on the schedule." And I said, "Great, what are they?" And they said, "Would you like to do Barry Manilow, Def Leppard, or Duran Duran?"
Who was the second one?
Def Leppard. It was Barry Manilow, Def Leppard, or Duran Duran. And I said Duran Duran on the basis that they had put out fewer albums than Barry Manilow. And it seemed like significantly less work. And actually, for a while, my Duran Duran, for probably about a decade, my Duran Duran album book was kind of my dark secret, in that I was very fortunate in that it came out, it was an immediate bestseller, sold out, and the publisher went into involuntary liquidation. And so it never got a second printing.
Right.
I never got paid the royalties I was owed. And I'd learned an incredibly good lesson, because I discovered that this was the thing that I'd done for the money. I'd done this absolutely for the money. It had paid my rent, it had bought me, it had graduated me up from an electric typewriter. No, graduated me up from a manual to an electric typewriter at the time. It's very exciting. And I did it for the money, and I hadn't got the money. And I just spent 3.5 months of my life writing a book that I didn't really want to read. And I put lots of good stuff into it, and I tried to make it as good as possible. And it was a lovely lesson, and it was a lovely lesson to have learned at the beginning of my career. Because if it had been a success, I might have become somebody who wrote dreadful cash-in rock books.
More Duran Duran books.
Not even more Duran Duran, I might have said yes to whatever was offered, and I might have burned out, and I was really glad I didn't. Because
But you then discovered the comic form, which you loved.
yes.
And this at the time probably wouldn't have had any dollars and cents up against it.
No, but it was what I wanted to do. And it was something I'd wanted to do since I was a kid. I mean, it's an anecdote that I've told before, but it's true. I was, when I was 15, going on 16, they had this careers advisory thing at my school, and you spent one day taking a battery of tests, and then the next day you got these careers advisors who came in and they reviewed your tests, and they suggested, they talked to you about whatever your chosen profession was and how you could achieve that. And I was kind of excited, because I had no idea how I was going to get to my chosen profession. And I was pulled out of German, and we went down to the sort of the school basement, and there's 4 or 5 of us in a line. One of us goes in, 10 minutes go by, he comes out. Next one goes in, 10 minutes go by, he comes out. And finally, I go in and I sit down. Pretty nice man sitting there with my scores, and he says, "So, Gaiman, what do you want to be then?" And I said, "I want to write American comics." And there was a really, really long pause. And after a while, he said, "How would you go about doing that then?"
So that's what I'm here to.
And I said, "You are the outside careers advisor, you tell me." And then we sat there looking at each other. And it was just a silence that went on for a while. And then he said, "Have you ever thought about accountancy?" And I said, "No, I have never thought about accountancy." And then we sat there some more for a bit, and then I said, "Shall I show the next boy in?" And he said, "Yes, I think you'd better." And that was the entirety of my careers advice, which obviously worked very well because I got the career I wanted.
It was good advice.
But I definitely had started out from a sort of position of you obviously can't get here from there.
What is it about that form that you found so appealing? I mean, I think you described it once as being something that you could really kind of invent in a way, that there wasn't the formulas set down and that you could make of it what you wanted to.
It was a lot less intimidating than prose.
Yeah.
As a young writer, I was very, very aware that people have been writing novels for things recognizably novels for 3,000 years or more. And you're sort of on the shelf with people who are really, really good at this thing. Comics have been around for about 100 years, and it seemed to me like there were an awful lot of things that nobody had tried.
Right.
And you actually could do the equivalent of walking out into the jungle, swinging your machete. You were doing things, I got to do things in Sandman that nobody had ever done before in comics. That was wonderful.
Yeah.
There were things I did that there weren't any rules against, because nobody had thought to make those rules because the rules didn't exist or whatever. So I loved that. But also I just loved comics. I loved it. I felt that comics were, when I was growing up, I always felt like comics was this medium with cool, unrealized potential. And then when I hit my mid to late teens and discovered girls and was in a punk group and things like that, I sort of went off the idea of comics as having this unrealized potential. But I still read Will Eisner. I would still buy the Spirit, the Collected Spirits. And then as a young journalist, I picked up an Alan Moore Swamp Thing on Victoria Station and flicked through it and went, "Oh my God, this is well written."
Yeah.
And I wish I could say, and I bought it, but I didn't. I actually put it back down, having read the whole thing. And it took like 2 months, 2 or 3 more months, me actually to go, I think I'm about to buy my first comic in 6 years. And probably much like a heroin addict going, I think I may just be about to take my first little bit of heroin for 6 years. But it was very much knowing that if I did this, then I was in this place.
Right.
And I read it, and I read Alan's stuff, and I just thought, this is what I want to do. This is magic. Here is somebody who is writing comics and putting as much intelligence, as much passion, as much wit, as much craft into it as anything that I'm seeing in the theater, anything that I'm seeing on film, anything that I'm seeing in prose. And I do want to do that thing. This is what I want to do.
And the perception of comics has completely changed now. I mean, it's back then it wasn't really a legitimate form of writing, or you weren't really a proper writer. But
that was so much fun. That was so great. I kind of miss those days.
Right.
I really do. The idea of, it's really fun creating things in the gutter because nobody's looking, and you can go off and do really interesting work, and nobody cares. Only you and the people who are reading it. And that as a dialogue, and that as a world, is a wonderful, wonderful thing. The problem...
Great freedom, yeah.
You have enormous freedom. You have, which I loved. This is a world in which I remember I was a journalist, 1986, Mouse, Dark Knight, and Watchmen are all just coming out. And I'm looking at the world and going, there is something really exciting happening. This is so cool. I have to write about this. And going to my editor and saying, I want to write about this phenomenon. I want to do a big article about comics. And the editor saying, we've already written about comics. And I said, what? He said, yes, this was Desperate Dan's 50th anniversary, and we did a piece on that about 8 months ago. So I then went from, that was a newspaper called Today, and I then went to the English Sunday Times magazine, and I said, I want to do an article on comics. And the guy said, okay. And I thought, great, I had a commission, and I went and I interviewed Brian Bolland and Frank Miller and Alan Moore and Dave Sim and Art Spiegelman, and we put together this amazing article, and I was so proud of it, and I sent it in, and I got a phone call from the editor, and actually I didn't hear anything from him, and so after about 5 days I phoned, and I said, article on comics. He said, yes. I said, well? He said, well, I have a bit of a problem with it. I said, okay, well, what's the problem? I will rewrite it. That's not a problem. Just let me know. I want this thing in print. He said, yes. He said, well, I think it lacks balance. And I said, well, in what way? And he said, well, these comics, you seem to think they're a good thing. And I agreed that it did lack balance in that way. And he sent me a kill fee that was actually twice what I normally got for writing an entire article, and I would rather have been paid less and had the article published, because as far as I was concerned, this was exciting. I loved that feeling, and when I got into comics and writing comics, it wasn't something you did for glory, it was something you did because it was what you wanted to do. I remember the first time I was actually invited to go and speak at a university, American University. It's in St. Louis. And I got there, and it was 1994, 95, somewhere like that. And I'm at this little lunch before I go and give my talk. And they say, by the way, you probably should know the English department is boycotting this, and nobody who is actually in the English department or studying English is actually permitted to come to your talk. We are the art department, we brought you in, and the English department is boycotting this because you do comics. I thought that was great. I loved the idea that people could care and feel so threatened by what I was writing that they were forbidding people from reading it and from coming to it. That was wonderful. And in some ways that was more, I shouldn't be saying this, should I? So in some ways that was more exciting and more fun than these days when, you get lists of places that have Sandman on the curriculum. And you get more invitations to come and speak at more universities than I could if I wanted to do it full time. I couldn't do it.
I know you never get any time for writing. One of the things, you are quite unique in that you write across so many genres. Short stories, films, comics, graphic novels, children's books, adults' books. There's quite I don't know anybody who has the kind of scope that you do. Is there a genre that you find easiest, or one that you prefer to work in, or one that's harder than others, or?
They all have different strengths and they all have different weaknesses, and you wind up playing to the strengths, and you wind up occasionally choosing to do something in one medium rather than another because it does different things and it has a wider range. I think my favorite medium of all is the one that I probably do the very, very least, which is radio plays. And I do that the least because, well, for apart from anything else, if I went full-time into writing radio plays, I would have to send my children out in the street to dance for pennies.
Yes, you would. You certainly would.
But it really is, it's a medium I love. It has all of the immediacy and the fun of writing for television or writing for film. And you can do it in a weekend, and your special effects budget is absolutely unlimited, and you never have that thing you have in film where if you're actually, you need to go and get a long shot now. Everybody has to go back to their trailers, and you have to relight the whole thing, and you have to move everything, and you have to put down the dolly tracks, and 7 hours later, everybody gets there, and they say that one line again, just with the cameras over there. Because if you're doing it in audio, all you do is you go like this. Yeah? And you did it. It's brilliant.
Cheap as chips.
It's good. So I love, and probably every 3-4 years I write a radio play. Luckily the BBC still do them.
How do you decide, you come up with a story idea and it's in your head, how do you decide that's going to be a kid's book, or that's going to be a radio play, or it's going to be a film script,
Well, sometimes the decision is kind of made for you, and sometimes you make a decision and you're wrong. Some things you just know when they turn up. I knew what The Graveyard Book was when it turned up.
See,
I wasn't good enough to write
smiling
it.
as soon as you say The Graveyard Book, and I think of nobody.
But I did. I was 25. I was a young journalist. We lived in this very tall house in which every floor, pretty much every room was on a different floor, and there were stairs between, very long and windy. And my son Mike, who is now 25 and was then about 2, loved his tricycle more than anything in the world. And I really didn't like him riding it in the house because there were stairs. And so what I would do is, and we didn't have any kind of yard or garden, so I would walk him across the lane to the graveyard over the road. And he would pedal his tricycle round and round the graveyard incredibly happily. And I would sit and read a book or just watch him. And I remember just one day looking at this little boy toddling delightedly amongst the headstones. And I thought, he looks so at home here. I thought you could do a whole story about a little kid who wanders into a graveyard and is raised by dead people. And actually, it would just be like the Jungle Book, only instead of being raised by animals and taught all the things that the jungle animals know, you'd be raised by dead people and taught all the things that dead people know.
Which is some very cool things.
And that was my idea. And I went straight up to my study and I started to try and write it. And I wrote about a page, which was basically the first page where the dead people are gathered around the baby and Silas turns up. And that wasn't very good. And I thought, this is actually a better idea than I am a writer. So I will go and write other things until I get good enough for the idea. And every few years, I'd come back to it.
So how long was that book in the process? From when you
It was in my head for about 23 years.
I was going to say, that's a long time.
It got finally, and I would go back every 4 or 5 years. I'd just write a page, and I'd look at it, and I'd go, no, still not there. And then finally, in about 2002, 2003, I thought, I don't think I'm getting any better anymore. So it probably doesn't matter if I'm good enough anymore. This is now what I've got. And that was the point where I called my publisher and I said, okay, next children's book I'm going to be doing is this thing called The Graveyard Book. And then I had this bright idea. I knew that I wanted it to be a novel, and I knew it had to be a novel that was also built of short stories. which in itself is a kind of problematic way of writing something. And I thought, well, what if instead of doing this thing that I've been doing for years of starting at the beginning, and I think even at that point I had the first 2 or 3 pages from, there was a hand in the darkness and it held a knife, all the way through of him just wandering through the house. I had that written. But I thought, what if I just do a story? And I thought, well, there's going to be about 8 chapters in this book, because I want to do one every 2 years. It's going to go from age 2 to about age 16. So I'll do one in the middle. And that was The Witch's Headstone. And we were on holiday, which I don't do holidays very well. I can do about a day and a half normally of holiday. I can go, yes, I'm on holiday. Look at me, I'm not writing. I'm on holiday. Oh, I'm on holiday, I am so on holiday. Yes, look, sun, I have put on my bathing costume, I'm on a beach. And by day 2, it's just like, kill me now. So I'm sitting in a deck chair on a beach, and I've got my notebook, and I'm now surreptitiously started writing. Not being on holiday. It was great. And I wrote the first page of The Witch's Headstone, and I just got to the point of going, this is rubbish. It's absolute rubbish. When Maddie came out of, my daughter, who at that point would have been about 10, came out of the sea, came and sat down next to me. She said, what are you doing? I said, I'm writing the thing. She said, read it to me. So I read her the first page and a half, and she said, what happens next? And that, if you're an author,
it's pretty good.
It's the question. So then I had to keep writing it, so that she found out, and each day I'd read her what I'd done that day.
So you didn't write it in sequence, I remember.
Well, after that I wrote it. I wrote chapter 4 first, which was lovely, because it gave me a sense of taste, and it gave me an idea of who Bod would be when he was 8.
Right.
And then I went off and wrote the first chapter, and then in about April 2007, I rented a tiny little cottage in Cornwall, which I rented only because I was promised that not only would there be no wireless signal or anything like that, but also cell phones would not work there, and it had no phone.
Perfect spot.
And so I went away to this little cottage in Cornwall, and I wrote chapters 2 and chapter 3, and then I wrote chapter 5. Chapter 6 and chapter 7 were mostly written in New Orleans. I thought, I want to go somewhere where there's lots of really cool graveyards. And New Orleans was sort of the closest.
You spent a lot of time at Highgate Cemetery, didn't you?
I did. I went to, well,
a beautiful cemetery.
And Audrey Niffenegger showed me around, who I met through you.
Yeah.
Audrey wrote The Time Traveler's Wife, and is a wonderful artist in her own right. And I've met her at the Sydney Writers' Festival. And then I discovered that she had this sort of very strange, not actually a day job, which is she was guiding 3 people through Highgate Cemetery West, which is the really scary, old, decrepit one. And so I got Audrey to show me around. It was brilliant.
I wanted to ask you about the adult novels, and particularly about. Oh, here come the questions. Oh, great. Okay. I've got too many more for you, though. I think no, I'm going to get to this. But I wanted to ask you. You talk about the United States. I mean, one of the things that's been said of you is that at some point somebody said, your books are not very political, but I think they are very political, particularly.
I'm enjoying this sort of. I seem to have a newfound politicization.
You do. But I think it was well.
But no, what I was just going to say is particularly when Sandman came out. Sandman came out in an era in which it seemed like all of the other British writers of my era and generation, Jamie Delano, Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, Pete Milligan, Pat Mills, all of these guys, when they were writing comics for adults, you'd get blood-sucking Margaret Thatchers on the cover and Nixon in it, and you'd get a big statement that this was political. And books would come out on the graphic novel circa of the late 80s and early 90s, in which I would be sort of ostentatiously nudged to one side as unfortunately completely ruining whatever theses the people had about what was meant to be going on, because I was not political. And I think I remained officially completely non-political until 2003 and the invasion of Baghdad, when suddenly Sandman 50, published in 1993, was panels from it were turning up in newspapers around the world. And a couple of weeks ago, there was a thing on a website that was quoted where they actually went and compared and contrasted Bush officials' statements about how torture was not only a necessary thing, it actually was better for the people who were being tortured to be tortured, because they were being tortured by Americans who were doing it with love and kindly. And, you know, it would have been so much. And they were comparing and contrasting with lines from Sandman about people torturing.
Waterboarding is an act of love, I think. I think it's been very misunderstood.
But that, I loved that. It was like, yes, I was more political than I thought. But I always figured that the personal is the political.
But American Gods has a lot of politics in it. I mean, you talk about the Indian people, you talk about the Path of Tears, which is an amazing part in that book, where the Indians, maybe you can talk about that, and, I think that book is full of politics.
I think what it's filled with is people, and politics and people, I do not believe are removable one from the other. The cliche in the 80s of the personal is political isn't a cliche, it's true. So I think if you're going to include anything about the nature of history, if you're going to start talking about countries, if you're going to start talking about things, you are talking by definition about politics. And honestly, at any point that you are saying things that other groups do not want said, at any point that you are up there as an author, just writing about people that other people do not want written about. I remember one of the most exciting things for me in the early days of Sandman, the point where I went, I think I'm really doing something right, was when we received a formal notice from the American Family Association that they, in association with the Concerned Mothers of America, were now boycotting Sandman because of the positive depiction of homosexuality in Sandman. We were now boycotted until we repented. And should we wish to repent, we could write to the American Family Association. They would print this in their newspaper, and then members of the American Family Association and the Concerned Mothers of America would now start buying Sandman in obviously the numbers they had previously.
I guess that's still boycotting, right?
I'm so proud. We've never recanted.
Is the boycott still in place?
But what is lovely about something like that is that it's absolutely political. You're saying things that people do not want said, and they are reacting to it. And the joy, that was pretty much the point where I discovered the concept of the First Amendment. That was the point where I started getting active for the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. That was the point where, some years later, that moved into me doing stuff for Penn. It's like you need to be free to say things. You need to be free to write things, and these things need to be said.
Do you think that American Gods could have been written? I mean, you as an outsider that book is all about, the middle of America and myths and all sorts of things. Do you think you being an outsider enabled you to see? There's some fantastic, I've just got a quote here. People gamble to lose money. They come to casinos for the moment in which they feel alive, to ride the spinning wheel and turn with the cards and lose themselves with the coins and the slots. They brag about the nights they won, the money they took from the casino, but they secretly treasure the times they lost. It's a sacrifice of sorts. I'm interested in that you, as an outsider coming to the United States, traveling around, looking at the United States and being able to write this book.
The American Gods grew out of the fact that I'd lived in America when I began it for about 7 years. And I was becoming increasingly fascinated and obsessed, living out in the Midwest, with the fact that the America that I was living in was not an America that I was seeing on television and not really reading about in books. And that began as the thing that just fascinated me. When I was writing Sandman, a lot of it was set in England. A lot of it was written in England, a lot of it was set in America. And people would say, well, how can you write, how can you write stuff set in New York? And I would say, well, we get your TV, we get your movies. I visited on occasions to go to the DC offices, and honestly, I'm probably not writing a New York that is anywhere near as good or as accurate or as deep as a New Yorker would write, but I'm probably writing a New York that's comparable to a New York that a Seattle novelist would write, who's been to New York a couple of times as well. It's the same kind of thing. What started fascinating me, and was the seed, I think, of American Gods, was the stuff that I just wasn't seeing anywhere, hadn't seen. And the stuff that I found seriously weird, and that nobody else seemed to. It's the first point where the little town I live, in winter, they would, as soon as the little lake in the center of the town hardened, they'd drive a car onto it. And I'd say, what's that for? And they said, oh, we take bets on when it'll go through the ice. It's for charity.
I guess the charity didn't have dead bodies.
The really weird thing is, after the book came out, somebody came over to me, and my doctor, who had read it, Dan Johnson, Dr. Dan, and he said, Neil, so you must have heard about the car down at Jake's. I said, what? He said, you didn't? I said, no. And it turned out that there was a car parked, as these things go, down in the river that actually flowed into that lake. And it had been parked there for years, in the river. I mean, just somebody had driven it into the river one day. And because the natives in that part of the world don't seek to question this kind of thing.
Come on, kids, get out. We're in the river.
They didn't. What they'd done is, for many years, they'd used it as a sort of diving board, and kids would climb in, and they'd climb onto the car, and they'd dive in and stuff. And after the car had been there about 8 years, they decided to haul it out, and that was when they discovered the skeleton in the trunk.
Oh my God! Oh wow!
And I had to say, no, I didn't know about that, Dan.
Wow. How do you get yourself back into the mind of a child when you're writing a children's book? I mean, Nobody Owens, that's so, and the Coraline books as well. Not books. How do you get back into that space where you can imagine you're so wonderful at describing the fear that a child feels, or any of the, I don't know, it feels like you're that age again.
Two-part answer. First part, probably unhelpfully, I have no idea how.
Yeah.
Second part, possibly more helpfully, and may shine a little light onto it. I've said I was a booky kid. I used to read. I loved reading. And one of the things that as a child used to puzzle me, and I use puzzle in its technical sense here, it really pissed me off, was books written by adults that were children's books, in which the person who wrote them had no idea what it was like to be a child. Had obviously not a clue. And I would read these books, and I'd go, it's not like this. And there were good writers for whom you'd go, it's not right like this, even. And there were very bad writers, but I was forever going, it's not like this. This is not how we feel. This is not what the world of childhood is like. And every now and then you'd get one, you'd go, oh, that got it right. And sometimes it was good children's books with children in, and sometimes it would be something like Lord of the Flies, and you'd still go, yes, that's right. It's like that. You wouldn't get that feeling of deep wrongness. And sometimes it was a weirdly romanticized wrongness. I love I love Ray Bradbury. I think Bradbury is one of the authors who in many ways sort of, carved my childhood. I loved his fiction, but I loved all his adult fiction. The stuff where he had kid protagonists, with the exception of a story called Homecoming, always left me cold as a kid, because they'd forever be putting on their special sneakers and going, "Now I will run forever." And I'd be going, it doesn't actually work like that. I know nobody. Hey, anybody here ever put on sneakers and go, now I can run? No, you neither, eh? Says we do,
What I wanted to ask you too is, can you tell me about your discipline as a writer? I mean, your life, I know a little bit about it because I tried to track you down, and you will be unbelievably busy. How do you get the work done? Do you have a routine where you...
I used to always get it done somehow, and then this year has been slightly problematic, and combination of winning the Newbery and my dad dying and Coraline and loads of things have meant that actually for the first time in 20-something years, I recently blew a deadline, and had never done that before, and had a short story, and I basically had to say to the guys, this will not get finished.
Yeah.
You have a story, it's not working, and I do not have the time and I don't have a week of quiet to just go off and get it done. But normally what I try and do is have a routine when I'm writing a novel. Novel writing, and normally I go away for the beginning of a novel. Just for the first chapter. I'll head off somewhere. I'll borrow a house from a friend who has too many houses and not enough bodies. Or I'll go somewhere unlikely. To finish American Gods, I actually wound up going to Las Vegas on the basis that I spoke to a travel agent who said, honestly, the cheapest nice hotel rooms in America are in Las Vegas at that point. So I said, okay, and I went down to one, and I checked in, and the guy said, look, this is kind of weird, but nobody ever comes here for 2 weeks. And you're here for 2 weeks. Why are you here for 2 weeks? And I said, well, I'm actually going to be writing a novel. And he said, really? And I said, yeah. He said, nobody's ever done that before here either. So they gave me this huge corner room just because they were so thrilled that somebody was going to be sitting in the Tropicana writing a novel.
Have they put a plaque outside the door saying American Gods is written here?
No. But again, it's that thing where I just want to go mad for a little bit. I just want to get to that point where I'm suddenly doing the kind of word count that I don't normally do in a day. I can actually, all I do is just write, and when I can't think straight, I fall asleep, and then I wake up the next morning and I start writing, and I'm doing 6,000-7,000 word days, and it's all a bit mad, and that is wonderful. But that's not my normal, normally on a book like American Gods, you sort of start it like that, and you finish it in that kind of madness like that, but all the middle stuff is quietly doing 1,000 to 2,000 words every day, maybe a little bit more on a good day, maybe a little bit less on one of the days when you're really grumpy with yourself, and handwriting. And I love handwriting mostly because if I'm handwriting, nobody can pop up a message on my screen. Urgent email, it doesn't bother me. If I need to spell a word, I'm not going to Google it and surface 3 hours later just having bought something odd that I didn't need on eBay. These things will not happen, right. So I'm just off handwriting, and my only weird little affectation these days is I try and write in 2 different colors of ink so I can see how much I did yesterday.
Oh, okay.
So I'll be one day I'll be brown ink and the next day maybe purple or green or something, but at least that way I can go, oh, that was a good day. Yeah, whoa, look at that. 14 pages, yeah, go me. And, and that's fun. And then 3 pages.
I'm taking some of your questions now. Do you have a special process for creating characters, particularly villains?
I have a process for creating characters, particularly villains. No, the only thing that's important to me about my characters, and especially important about villains, is that I would want to spend time with them. I might not want to do what they do,
Want to spend
but if
time
I
with
met them
Jack?
at a party, I would not be bored. You know, I mean,
If you live to tell the tale.
Well, but I do think honestly, the meeting them at a party rule is a really good rule for any kind of character creation. If I met this person at a party, would I want to stay and talk to them, or would I say, just going to go and get something from the kitchen and flee? And it was the point where, and it was a rule that I came up with halfway through a novel by somebody who I won't name because she's an incredibly fine novelist. And I was halfway through this novel, and I suddenly thought, you know, if I met any one of these people in any kind of social context, I would do everything I could to get away from them. Why am I voluntarily sitting here with them? And that was the very first book I ever stopped reading halfway through. I don't want to be with these people. I put it away. So that is my main rule for characters and for villains, is they could be as bad as anything, but I would really like, but if I was in their company at a party, even if I'm just standing there going, oh my God, I can't believe they just said that. You know? And other than that, it's sort of fun. Some of them, you know, go and live in your head for a while.
Yeah.
Krupp and Vandermeer were in my head for a long time before they ever found a book to go into.
Right.
I sort of borrowed them from my head to put them into Neverwhere, because I went, well, I need some villains, and I have Krupp and Vandermeer, and they came out of life in a weird kind of way, in that I think I was about 17, maybe 18, and I was going for a long walk, about a mile away from my house, and I reached this place that was always completely deserted, and nobody ever walked there, and suddenly there's these two guys walking towards me, and one was sort of small and oily, and one was huge and sort of dead-faced, and it was the scariest thing that's, I think, ever happened to me, with no rationale.
Right.
These two guys in these slightly tatty suits coming towards me, and probably in their mid to late 20s. And I just remember breathing a sigh of relief when they'd got past me and I was still alive. And I thought, they're Mr. Krupp and Mr. Vandermeer, and I will put them in a story. And they'd hover, and occasionally I'd think, and I nearly put them in Sandman, then I thought, no, I want to keep them for something that's mine. So they went into Neverwhere.
We have a question from Romania. What is, comma, in your opinion, comma, the main difference between American, Japanese, and European comic traditions?
I think you have hugely different comic traditions, and I don't even think there's a European comic tradition. I think the French comic tradition is absolutely nothing like the English comic tradition, for example. The bande dessinée tradition is a wonderful thing, and bears no relationship to the English comedic sort of comic cuts tradition. I think that what fascinates me most about all of these traditions, though, is the way, the huge thing they have in common, which is they've all become kind of world currency. European, less so. I mean, and European less so, I think, mostly just because of costs. The traditional European graphic album is a beautiful, fully painted thing of beauty and respect, and they cost an awful lot to make, and there are a few of them around. The joy of manga was originally that of cheapness,
Yeah.
and is still in many ways that of cheapness. They came out of a world in which you had lots and lots of paper. In the European tradition, you don't tend to have cinematic, you tend not to slow things down, you tend to compress things into beautiful panels. The Japanese tradition is one that's much more of expansion, of, you know, something that somebody in Europe, in a beautiful French bande dessinée, might have done in a panel, might be 7 or 8 pages in manga.
Can you talk about the relationship you have with the artists that you work with? You know, I'm interested in that kind of, how that breaks down, how that relationship
Well, every
works.
every relationship is different, and every relationship is strangely personal and very, very peculiar. And there are artists. The most important thing for me as a writer of comics, particularly, and to some extent of doing children's picture books now, is you find somebody that you trust, and you then write a script that is in essence a letter to that person. One of the things that I would always do when I was beginning to write for a new artist is I would first of all just look at everything that they drew and figure out what I liked about what they did and what I didn't like about what they did. And because what I'd obviously want to do is always try and play to their strengths and always try and minimize their weaknesses. What I started doing fairly early on in Sandman was I would call an artist, and when it was time to start working with somebody new, the first thing I would make is a phone call to them, and I would basically say, look, tell me what you like drawing, tell me what you don't like drawing, and tell me what you'd love to draw that nobody has ever let you draw. And sometimes that in itself would generate a story. You know, somebody says, you know, I really like drawing cats. You go, oh, that could be a story. And somebody says, I will draw anything, but please no cars. I hate drawing cars. You go, good. So that artists and writers, any creative people, work really well when given boundaries. They work really well when given limits. The worst thing that you can do in terms of being an editor who has things on deadline is to say to somebody, you know, or doesn't have things on deadline, is to say to somebody, you know, I love what you do. Do something for me. You can do anything you like. No rules. And it's amazing how quickly nothing turns up. Whereas you can talk to the same people and say, we're doing an anthology about cats who believe they're Shakespeare. Could you do me an original story about a cat who believes he's Shakespeare, or Shakespeare believing he's a cat? Either way, we're something feline, something Shakespearean, blend them together. And the stories are just going to start chugging in, because the moment that you give people barriers, the moment that there are things, then you have a parameter to create art within. And one of the things that I would love about any artist I'd work with is figuring out what do they like, what don't they like, what are they good at, what aren't they good at, what do they want to do, and suddenly I had a parameter. Right. And it makes us both look good. It was really strange for me on this recent two-part detective, which it got a bit delayed partly because of just some production problems, but also it got delayed because Andy Kubert was, once he got into this thing, was just making sure that it was the best work of his career. Right. And we knew that everybody's out there checking their watches and going, this Wednesday? No, okay. But we also knew that when it came out, nobody was going to be going, well, we waited 10 weeks for this. Everybody was just going to be going, this is the best stuff of Andy Kubert's career, which they are.
Okay, we've got to wrap up in a second, but I have two questions that I want to ask you quickly. Are you aware that at the beginning of this event, you were sitting in a way that was just like how Morpheus sits sometimes in Sandman? Could you comment on how much of yourself you put into your characters?
I put an awful lot of myself into all of them. I'm not sure that Morpheus got an awful lot more of me than anybody else did. And I mean, there are weird things, like, you know, as I have aged, my hair has got more and more bizarrely like his, and that was not intentional. That was sort of this I wasn't meant to be this mad squiggle, and when I was 27 writing it, I just went, well, I want hair that I can draw easily, so mad squiggle. And then, you know, one day it does this, and it's sort of the most random hair in the universe. Wake up, and half of it has decided to be curly, and half of it's decided to be straight, and half of it's just gone, I'm going up. The biggest thing that I gave him was my dress sense, because And that was more as a reaction to anything else?
Black and black and black. And speaking of dress sense,
Yes.
which segues nicely to the next question. Are those the new boots?
These are the boots, yes. These are... yes, I went on my first actual sort of... It was sort of a failed shopping spree, in truth. It started off incredibly well, because the first thing we bought was the boots. And I went, yes, these are my boots. They have been waiting for me all my life. I have now put them on. I am wearing my boots. Lead on, GK. Wherever you go, I will follow. And then it really wasn't... we didn't get anything that was even comparable to the boots after that. You know. I'm actually thinking of blogging. I will probably blog the shopping trip just because it was so bizarre.
Sounds amazing. I want a shopping trip like that. I actually wore my special boots so we could have a little boot off, but...
You won. Yours are shiny, they have colour in them, they break up the otherwise unrelenting blackness.
Black on black. Well, listen...
They are glorious.
Neil, thank you very, very much. Neil will be available to sign your books at the back. And book.
Or
sorry.
thing. Let's just so you know, I have to fly to France this evening, so
one book per
it's going to be the
person.
most efficient and soulless signing I will ever have done. I apologize now. Obviously, I would love to do the kind of signing I normally do, and lots of hugging and photographing and all of that stuff, and it's not going to happen. This is
He's going to get
you
on a
guys
plane.
through like it's efficient. Sorry.
But also, I would love to encourage you all to stick around because we have 2 more amazing events with graphic.
You have Sean Tan, you have Adrian Tomanet, you have all sorts.
Yeah, so
It's
please do stick
exciting.
around. But thank you very much, Neil Gaiman.
Thank you for coming.